General Feuchtinger awarded Major Willy Kurz the Knight's Cross and Major Lear of I Battalion the German Cross in Gold. Both received their decorations for their personal commitment during the fighting in Normandy. On the 25th October 1944, I was again sent for by Feuchtinger, this time with the commander of my headquarter company, Lieutenant Karl Sommer, and a man from his company, Lance Corporal Maurer. For their unprecedented commitment during the defensive fighting at Epinal, Luneville, and Châtel, Lieutenant Sommer was formally awarded the German Cross in Gold and Maurer the Knight's Cross. It was rare for a Lance Corporal to receive the Knight's Cross. So in this case a war correspondent and a film team recorded the event. The deed for which Maurer received his great honor was not only remarkable but showed also the high level of training and the high morale of our men. During one of our disengaging movements I had placed my headquarter company on high ground to cover the withdrawal of my combat group long enough to enable us to reach our next position. Without the support of artillery or anti-tank weapons, but depending only on their own heavy machine guns, Sommer, from his commanding position, had forced the enemy to take cover again and had thereby procured us the necessary time to set up a new defense. Lance Corporal Maurer, with his machine gun and an ammunition bearer, had been engaged on the left wing of his company, to secure its left flank. His task, to hold up the enemy and only withdraw in the event of heavy pressure. In looking for a suitable spot Maurer had strayed too far to the left and virtually lost touch with his company. But he had found an ideal position on a commanding hill and knew what he had to do. Suddenly he saw in the valley below him an enemy column marching south. They were planning to go around us and attack in the flank, was his first thought. The enemy had apparently assumed there was no one left on the hills, for vehicle by vehicle the column moved past him below. When the enemy had come close enough, Maurer opened fire on the column, which at once stopped. The men jumped out of their vehicles and took cover. Maurer saw the wounded collapse. With the help of his ammunition bearer he fired one belt after the other from his MG. The first trucks caught fire. The confusion was complete. Then came the first reactions. Anti-tank guns and light artillery were brought into position and opened fire. Maurer laughed. "There is no way they can hit us from that angle, come on. Let's have the next belt." The shots did in fact whistle over his head. The enemy then formed up for an attack on the hill. "You have just had the last belt of cartridges, pal. We have got to get out of here," shouted his ammunition bearer. "Come on, back to the company." But Lieutenant Sommer had already moved off and from the start had not noticed Maurer's absence. "Okay, then we will just march east." We were bound to find the company, or von Luck's combat group, somewhere or other. As the two set off on foot, they could still hear the enemy's guns and in the distance the shouts of the attacking infantry. When Maurer had found his company and was brought to me by Lieutenant Sommer, he wondered more than anything why such a fuss was being made of him. "It was my job, was not it?" was his surprised comment. Never had a recommendation for a Knight's Cross been complied with so quickly as with Maurer. He was at once held up in propaganda as a shining example to all young men, who were being sent to the front in ever greater numbers. In November, Sommer was unfortunately taken prisoner. October went by. The Allies' supply problem seemed to have been solved. General Hatten was on the move to the northeast in the direction of Saarbrücken. We now stood with our backs to the Vosges behind the river Meurthe. Opposite us was still the 2nd French Armored Division. Among those serving in its ranks was a successful entrepreneur called Michel Defresne. Though neither of us could have known it at the time, when the French private and the German colonel facing each other in anonymous hostility, we would later become friends. In normal times Michel Defresne lived in a beautiful old chateau in Normandy, which his wife Elizabeth, scion of an ancient aristocratic family, had brought with her into their marriage. The Château Vimmer lay only a few kilometers outside Vimoutiers, an idyllic little town which in 1944 had gained a sad fame. In July, in its outskirts, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been severely wounded in a fighter attack. In August bitter fighting had taken place in the town and its vicinity between the Germans breaking out of the Falaise pocket and the Allies trying to close it. I myself had set up a defensive front with my combat group north of the town, to prevent any further advance by the British. While Elizabeth Defresne had converted her chateau into a military hospital, the roof bore a huge red cross and she took in wounded without regard to person. Her husband Michel served in the 2nd French Armored Division. All this may have been one of the reasons why after the war Michel became an enthusiastic amateur historian, concerning himself with the fighting in Normandy and especially with the fighting around the Fosse pocket. Besides studying archive material and obtaining interviews with prominent commanders on both sides, as well as many well-known historians, Michel looked me up in Hamburg and we became good friends. At that time, he told me later, I was the driver of a jeep for a platoon commander in the 4th Engineer Company of the 2nd French Armored Division under General Leclerc. On the 30th of October our division attacked, to force a crossing of the River Meurthe. This attack was apparently badly prepared and was repulsed. Then in the night before the 31st of October we crept up to the Germans and cleared away their mines. After good artillery preparation we accompanied our tanks and were able to cross the Meurthe northwest of Baccarat. In a little village we took a few prisoners, boys of 16, one of whom I kept the whole day in my jeep. We knew from prisoners that the German 21st Panzer Division lay opposite us. I could remember the fighting around Baccarat well, and also that we had been able to beat off an attack by the French. Unfortunately, Feuchtinger turned this defensive success of ours into a victory report. With the combined fire of the artillery and our few anti-tank guns we were able in a very short time to destroy more than 40 enemy tanks. It was humanly understandable that in such a desperate situation as ours attempts would be made through such reports to gain a little glory with the higher commands and give one's own people heart. But as the responsible commander of the combat group, I cannot confirm the defensive success in this form. Michel Defresne naturally wanted to know later how things had seemed to us. When I told him of Feuchtinger's report, he said, "We had several dead and wounded in our patrol. In the attacks of 30 and the 31st of October the division lost about a dozen tanks and 40 men. This is confirmed by the Fonds Historiques, Archives Musky in Paris, and by General Chauly, who found Feuchtinger's statement somewhat fanciful. During the following days, we managed to hold the western outlets of the Vosges. Then the order reached us to move to the area west of Strasbourg on the 12th of November, to be rested there for 14 days. On the 9th of November heavy falls of snow set in. The roads were soon iced over and passable only with difficulty. We were afraid that the enemy would push us into the Vosges, where we would have had enormous problems in getting over the icy, winding roads. But the enemy, too, slowed his advance. He was now aiming northeast in the direction of Strasbourg. An infantry division brought in from Slovakia relieved us. We were pulled out and very pleased at the prospect of a few days' rest, of replacements of men and materiel. Instead of that, in the evening of 2 November the division was sent north, to stop Patton's advance on the River Nid, between Metz and Saarbrücken. After a few days of heavy defensive fighting we were outflanked on the left and in the evening of the 18th of November pulled out. We started to feel like the fire brigade, which has to go wherever there's a fire to put out. But it was burning everywhere. The very next day we were sent north, to occupy the approaches to the western wall at Sarlaudem-Sarlouis. As we crossed the French-German border, it came home to all of us that from now on we would be fighting on our own native soil. At the beginning of November my adjutant, Libeskind, became very ill and had to be admitted to hospital. He did not come back until the 22nd of December. His duties were taken over by Captain Krieger, who on Liebeskind's return had to be given special leave. His only son was killed in an air raid on Solingen. The French chapter was closed. As yet we were in the approaches to the once proud impregnable western wall. A quick inspection of the fortifications confirmed our fears. Since the end of the French campaign in 1940, the bunkers and defense installations had come to resemble the castle in Sleeping Beauty. Armaments and communication systems had been dismantled and reinstalled in the Atlantic Wall. In the approaches to the bunkers a wild growth had sprung up which certainly made the hideous concrete blocks look more peaceful, with trees, bushes, and flowers, but it reduced the field of fire to nil. I at once sent a party to the western wall to find out whether it would be at all usable. My orderly officer came back with this report. Lieutenant Colonel, we first had to round up the responsible caretaker from the local theater, to get the bunkers unlocked. It would take weeks to put the installations into a defensible state, to say nothing of arming them with heavy guns and anti-tank weapons and minefields. The caretaker has not even got a plan of the installations and does not know whether one exists. We can forget about any effective defense from the system of bunkers. On the western bank of the Saar lay the little town of Wallerfangen, its houses clustered around a manor house. It suddenly occurred to me that the manor house of Wallerfangen was the seat of the von Papen family. I drove there at once and met the two sisters of my friend Franz von Papen. Both told me in no uncertain terms that they wanted to stay there whatever might happen. I tried to persuade them to leave the manor house, since there would be heavy fighting and no one would be able to have any regard for them or the house. With heavy hearts they eventually agreed. Not long afterward Wallerfangen became a heap of ruins. We set up our positions between the bunkers, which could now serve only as shelter from heavy artillery and air attacks. Then, on the 19th of November, the Americans began their attack on the Saar crossings between Saarlautern and the Orscholz block east of Metz. We were concerned with the 10th U.S. Armored Division and the 90th U.S. Infantry Division, which attacked our line Saarlautern-Orscholz along a wide front. Their goal seemed clear to us, to push through, over the Saar to the northeast, past Kaiserslautern, to the Rhine. My combat group was split up, while Major Kurz with 11 Battalion defended in Saarlautem and became involved in tough house-to-house fighting with black Americans, who climbed the houses with knives in their mouths. I had to send Major Lear with I Battalion to Merzig, to help the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, which was engaged in heavy defensive fighting there. Again, the excellent American artillery helped to force small breaches. Between the 23rd of November and 2 December, fierce fighting raged in the whole area of Saarlautern, Dillingen, and Merzig, where on the 29th of November the enemy managed to open a deep breach to the east at Saarlautem-Saarlouis. Owing to its heavy losses, our division now consisted solely of my combat group. We were pulled out in the middle of December and sent far to the east, past Saarbrücken, to the area between Pirmasens and Wissembourg, to be restored to strength, as reserve for Army Group G for the 3rd U.S. Army. The way to the Rhine lay open. It thrust north of Saarbrücken toward Kaiserslautern. The next danger now looming came from the U.S. Army Group that was advancing northward from the south and southwest, from the Nancy-Baccarat area, past the slopes of the Vosges. It was trying to penetrate the Rhine valley between Kaiserslautern and Colmar, with the goal of taking Strasbourg and crossing the Rhine. Yet we were granted a short respite. We had now been in action for more than 6 months without a break. Our losses had been high. All the same, our young replacements thanks to our veterans had been successfully integrated time and again. Here at the front the young men had quickly shed their illusions about marching with Hitler into a 1,000-year Reich. They had soon grasped the difference between propaganda and reality. We lay with the combat group between the now useless installations of the Western Wall at Zweibrücken on the Saar and Pirmasens. On New Year's Eve we all got together. We did not know how things would go, but we understood nevertheless that the war was no longer to be won. We only knew that we had to do our duty. Meanwhile, something had been happening. On the 16th of December 1944, Hitler had started the Ardennes offensive. We had heard about it marginally and had heard Goebbels' strident voice on the radio. The Wehrmacht has launched its great offensive. We will destroy the enemy and cut all his lines of communication. Paris is our goal. Our comment on this news had been unanimous. How did Hitler think he could ever succeed in getting through the snowed in Ardennes, over the icy, winding roads, with battered or inexperienced divisions and under the complete air superiority of the Allies? What we did not yet know on that New Year's Eve was that the unexpected offensive on our part had at first been successful, but then, on the 28th of December, had come to nothing. The turn of the year had just been celebrated. We had drunk to a new year full of question marks with a modest glass of punch, when a message reached us that the division was to prepare to move out that very night. I was summoned to Feuchtinger at his command post. He was very grave, wished me a happy new year, and gave me the following briefing. On the 28th of December, I was called to Army Group G, where I met all the Army, Corps, and divisional commanders. From there we went to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who told us that Hitler wished to speak to us all that afternoon at his headquarters in Bad Nauheim. There we also met Field Marshal Keitel, Colonel General Jodl, Himmler, and Bormann. The presence of the highest army and party leaders pointed to an important communication from Hitler. He began as usual with a long speech and emphasized that we were waging an ideological war, the loss of which would destroy the German people. I have not the slightest intention of losing the war. Think of Frederick the Great and his 7-year war. Hitler then came to speak of the Ardennes offensive, in which not all the objectives had been achieved, a highly optimistic view, it seemed to me, but which had had an incidental consequence, namely, the weakening of the American front opposite us, where Operation North Wind was to begin. He estimated the strength of the Americans on our front as down to only 4 or 5 divisions, which he proposed to destroy with 8 offensive German divisions, in order to follow up with further blows. Hitler then ended his address by saying, and these were his words, "It must be our absolute goal to settle the matter here in the West offensively. That must be our fanatical goal." Operation North Wind began on New Year's Eve. Feuchtinger went on. "Our division is the Army Group's reserve. Hitler's plan is to break through the Maginot Line south of Pirmasens with an armored group and advance south along the western fringe of the Vosges, in order to make contact with the 19th Army's bridgehead at Colmar. 5 divisions of Volksgrenadiers are to push through the Snowden Vosges from the west into the Rhine Valley and join forces with a bridgehead west of the Rhine. Although we have received replacements and now have 74 Panthers and Panzer IVs again," Feuchtinger concluded, "two things are being overlooked. We have no air superiority and nothing equivalent to set against the massive U.S. artillery. Our men are spent and the replacements have no experience. In accordance with orders, we shall assemble in readiness today. January 1944, just north of the Maginot Line. God be with you, Major Spro," who had now been given command of Regiment 192, and I looked at each other. Although nothing was said, it seemed to both of us that Hitler had decided to fight to the last man and to be prepared if necessary to have the German people conquer or go under. What happened was inevitable. The Americans had made very good preparations for an attack on their right flank and established themselves in the Maginot Line. The division of our forces into 2 assault groups, especially with the inexperienced infantry group, was unable to produce the desired result. Nevertheless, as we learned from prisoners and intercepted messages, Eisenhower, under the impact of the Ardennes offensive and Operation North Wind, begun on New Year's Eve, had ordered the attack on the western wall in northern Alsace to be abandoned for the time being. According to reports, Eisenhower and de Gaulle had agreed, on the 3rd of January, to withdraw to the Maginot Line in lower Alsace, retaining weak forces for the defense of Strasbourg. Operation North Wind made no progress. In the Snowden Vosges and to the west of them the 2 assault groups came to a standstill. A new plan was conceived. Our division and the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, swinging east from the area south of Wissembourg, were to break through the Maginot Line and trap the enemy in the Haguenau Depression. The 2 divisions were moved east and received orders to prepare themselves for this attack. One last dramatic battle lay before us. As I was leaving the divisional command post, an orderly officer of the staff took me to one side. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said, "I feel obliged to inform you, in your own interest and in that of your people, that court-martial proceedings are likely to be started against our divisional commander. 10 days ago General Feuchtinger was ordered to High Command West to provide information as to why on the night of 5 to the 6th of June 1944 he was not at his command post but in Paris. Feuchtinger was not at his command post but in Germany. I had to fetch him from there on the 24th of December and take him to Headquarter West. I feel obliged to inform you of this, as the commander of our combat group, so that you will know why our brave division has such a bad reputation with the higher commands." I was speechless. On Christmas Eve, while we had been putting up a desperate fight in the western wall at Saarlautern, our divisional commander had been at home. Certainly, we knew of Feuchtinger's fondness for la dolce vita. We knew of his contacts from pre-war days with high functionaries of the Nazi regime and disapproved of them. We also had been unable to understand why, during the decisive hours of the invasion, he had been in Paris, and not, moreover, only at the Special HQ. We commanders had always maintained our loyalty to Feuchtinger whenever our friends in other panzer divisions had sneered at his style of leadership and his way of life. Now even I felt this to be the last straw. Although I too hold to the saying de mortui nil nisi bene, of the dead say nothing but good, when brave men, who fought so brilliantly, and of the thousands of dead, wounded, and missing of those 6 months, I cannot help reproaching Feuchtinger with having done us all poor service. At the end of January 1945, when the bitter fighting was over, General Feuchtinger said goodbye to us, his commanders. Impassively we received his thanks for what we had done. In March, Feuchtinger was condemned by a court-martial. The sentence, however, was mitigated on orders from above and under the pressure of events was not carried, but I only heard of the court-martial proceedings against Feuchtinger long after my return from captivity. After his release from American captivity, he had eked out a living at various jobs and died at the end of the 1950s, shortly before new proceedings were to be brought against him. The battle for Hattenrittershoffen at the beginning of January 1945. The Vosges were deep in snow. In the lowlands between Wissembourg-Haguenau and the Rhine the snow was a foot deep. It was bitterly cold, the roads were icy. The civilian population was apprehensive, fearing that the war would once again ravage their villages. In many farmhouses there was no running water, the pipes were frozen. Wissembourg is a small town in northern Alsace on the border with the Palatinate. On the slopes of this area, around Landauerweiler and Bergzabern, the good Palatine wine was grown. To the east the Rhine was not far away, on the other side of which lay Baden-Baden in the Black Forest. Between the eastern slopes of the Vosges and the Rhine a wide lowland stretched south as far as Strasbourg. Our concentration area lay north of Wissembourg, where we arrived during the night of 5 to the 6th of January after a difficult march over icy roads. It was planned that the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, which had been unable to break the Maginot Line west of the Vosges, was likewise to assemble behind us during the following night. Our task was to push southward through the Maginot Line with 2 combat groups hard by the eastern foothills of the Vosges, close all outlets from the Vosges, and cut the enemy's communications with Strasbourg. I asked for maps with the exact location of bunkers and other fortifications. There were none. Not even the upper echelons had maps. To reassure us, we were told that the Maginot Line was barely manned and constituted no obstacle. Blind, we set off south on the 6th of January. Even before we had reached the first bunkers, we came up against fierce resistance and once again the concentrated fire of the American artillery. By the afternoon the 2 combat groups had indeed driven the enemy back, but we had still not come across the bunkers of the line. We continued the attack during the night of 6 and the 7th of January. Thick mist lay over the Rhine Valley. Visibility was down to 100 yards. Suddenly we could make out the first bunker, which received us with heavy fire. Our leading men and the accompanying SPW landed in thick mine fields. The artillery stepped up its barrage of fire. There was no doubt about it. The enemy intended to hold his position on the Maginot Line under all circumstances and keep his lines open to Strasbourg and the Rhine. Our division, which was now reduced to the fighting strength of a grenadier regiment, would not suffice to force a passage. From the prisoners we took in the approaches to the Maginot Line we knew who our opponents were, the experienced 79th U.S. Infantry Division, part of the 14th U.S. Armored Division and elements of the 42nd U.S. Infantry Division, as well as strong artillery. These were to be our concern for the next 14 days. Army groups seemed to have realized that the Americans were far stronger than expected. On the 8th of January, Captain Hare, accompanied by Grenadier and Army engineers, once again moved south. This assault party, with 12 Panthers, managed to force 1 bunker into surrender, shoot up 3 Shermans, and take many prisoners. He lost 1 Panther through mines. Then such heavy artillery fire descended on the bunker that Hare lost 20 grenadier and engineers, who had been sitting on his tanks. He had to withdraw. Army Group issued fresh orders. 2 days ago, south of the Haguenau forest, we managed to form a bridgehead over the Rhine north of Strasbourg. From this bridgehead a westward thrust is to be made to cut the communications of the enemy north of the Haguenau forest. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Division will move west on the 9th of January along the northern edge of the forest, break through the Maginot Line, and advance down the eastern slopes of the Vosges. The 21st Panzer Division will assemble on its right and after the first breakthroughs will likewise move west at once. On the 8th of January, 20 assault guns arrived from Germany. Captain Hare still had 2 tanks available. In the same day the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division assembled in 2 combat groups. Our division just north of it with my regiment in contact with the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. It was bitterly cold and snowing. Only rarely did the moon shine through. Then one could see the dark monsters looming up out of the snow. We knew that we had to cut through barbed wire entanglements and clear mines. For this only a few engineers were available and young replacements, soldiers of 16 and 17. During the night of 8 and the 9th of January the first assault party of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division worked its way up to the first bunker. Without a sound the youngsters crept forward and began to cut a passage through the barbed wire. Whenever the moon came out all movement froze. Toward 4 in the morning path had been cleared. It was only another 100 yards to the bunker. On all fours the assault party worked its way forward. Then they were there. The Americans seemed to be asleep. The barrel of a gun poked menacingly from its embrasure. The men crept around the bunker. The armored door was closed. An NCO beat against it with the butt of his gun and it slowly opened. The American crew had been taken completely by surprise and were quickly overcome. The noise alerted other bunkers and the intermediate positions. Heavy fighting broke out at once. The American artillery laid down a barrage of fire on the bunker. Then a combat group of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by assault guns, moved up to attack through the gap. Heavy artillery fire prevented a rapid advance. The group turned left and forced its way from the north into the little village of Hatten. At the same time an armored group from my division also moved up, with the intention of pushing past Hatten. Several tanks drove over mines. The attack made no progress. One of my battalions also entered Hatten from the north and relieved the elements of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division that were there. The southern part of the village was fiercely defended by American infantry, who mounted a counterattack. But this was Ripu. By the evening of the 9th of January only a small breach had been achieved. Army Group and Corps pressed for a continuation of the attack. The breakthrough in the Maginot Line was to be extended, in order to push through to the west. During the night of 9 and the 10th of January, my combat group, with Regiment 125, moved up to the bunker, to the right of me our sister Regiment 192. The division had been supplied with a further artillery regiment, so we were somewhat better supported. The armored group of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division had tried in vain to force its way also into the neighboring village of Rittershofen. Our division now prepared to take Rittershofen on the 10th of January. Reserve Major Willy Spro commanded Regiment .192 in place of the sick Colonel Roch. His attack on the Maginot Line north of Hatten had also come to a standstill on the 9th of January in front of the bunkers, his companies heavily reduced. As last reserve he still had his engineer platoon, consisting of 1 sergeant, 1 NCO, and 20 mostly inexperienced men. That evening Major Spro positioned his anti-tank guns and heavy weapons opposite a bunker that was standing out clearly. As Major Spro reported later, at first light I moved up with the platoon of engineers, while my heavy weapons fired non-stop at the gun ports in the bunker. We charged through the snow and within a few minutes were at the bunker. The engineers threw hand grenades into the ports, while others cut through the barbed wire and cleared mines. When we ran around to the rear entrance, the door opened and a white flag appeared with 5 officers and a garrison of 117 men. 4 of the officers had suffered severe eye injuries from the firing at the ports. They were treated at once by the regimental doctor. The others were sent to the rear. The bunker turned out to be a heavily armed stronghold in an extensive system of fortifications, so I at once made it my command post. Next day, in the Afik on the hills north of Rittershofen, Major Spro was severely wounded and taken to the hospital. On the 24th of February, for his personal bravery, he was awarded the Knight's Cross. On the 10th of January, I moved up with my regiment for the attack on Rittershofen. That night I succeeded in forcing my way into the village, but there too, just as at Hatten, the enemy held out in the houses and at once mounted a counterattack with tanks and infantry. This hit my 2nd Battalion in particular, which had established itself in the center near the church. In these 2 villages of Hatten and Rittershofen there now developed one of the hardest and most costly battles that had ever raged on the Western Front. The Americans strained every sinew to regain the Maginot Line, to avoid being cut off in the Strasbourg area. In Rittershofen we were only .20 yards apart. Sometimes we would be in the first floor of a house while the Americans were in the cellar and vice versa. This bitter house-to-house fighting raged for nearly 2 weeks. Both sides used their artillery non-stop, also flamethrowers. The Americans set fire to almost all the houses with incendiary shells. We took prisoners from the 827th U.S. Aéronord Battalion, which consisted almost entirely of blacks. They told us their instructions were to shoot up or set on fire any house in which Germans they Nazis were to be found. I had to leave my own cellar in a said hurry when an incendiary shell burst in front of my lookout and we were in danger of suffocation. I moved into another cellar quite close to the command post of Major Kurz, who with his 11 Battalion was having to bear the brunt of the attacks. Prisoners from the 14th U.S. Armored Division cursed, "God damn it, This is the bloodiest battle we have ever fought, worse than the legendary Battle of Anzio in Italy. Even now the civilian population remained in the two villages. Women, children, and old people, packed in like sardines, sat in the cellars of the houses. Electricity had been cut off, the supply of food was short, and there was no water for the pipes were frozen. We tried to help as much as we could. By day any movement was fatal. Our supplies could be brought up only by night in armored vehicles. In this we were helped by a hollow, which concealed us from the enemy, whose flares threw the area into brilliant light. As early as the second day my regimental doctor came to me and angrily said, "I have up to 50 wounded lying in a cellar who are in urgent need of medical treatment. I have no morphine left and hardly any dressings. In another cellar there are more than 40 dead, who cannot be buried here. I am also doing what I can for the civilians." On many nights I was at least able to send a few wounded civilians and men of my unit to the rear, past Hatten, and have ammunition brought up. My orderly officer, Drive. Muller-Tem, had to get the ammunition boxes forward to the grenadier, since all the other men of my staff were in action, to compensate to some extent for the losses in the two battalions.